Okay, so now we're going to switch locations and head out, or at least bring New Haven, Connecticut here to us and hear from Dr. Sydney Skelton Simon. Dr. Simon is an art historian and curator who specializes in post-World War II American art and design. She is currently the Bradley Assistant Curator of Academic Affairs at the Yale University Art Gallery in New Haven. And Simon's essay in our catalog details Bertoia's lifelong work in monotypes and their relation to his broader practice. And I should also say that Sydney got her PhD at Stanford University and did her dissertation on this very subject. So we were thrilled to have her write for our catalog as well. Let's see, are you guys ready to bring Sydney up? Excellent. Hi, Sydney.
Hi. Well, thank you very much, Jed, and to you and Marin for including me in this really amazing project. I'm reporting live from New Haven, where we're in the midst of I think what the New York Times is calling a bomb cyclone snowstorm. So I am both jealous of what is undoubtedly better weather in Dallas and also looking forward to seeing the exhibition live and in person. I wonder if I could get my slides up on the screen, please. Thank you. All right. And thank you also to the colleagues at the National for making this technology possible. It's pretty amazing. So before he was a furniture designer or a sculptor, Harry Bertoia made a name for himself as a printmaker. In the 1940s, working first in Michigan at the Cranbrook Academy of Art and then in Southern California, Bertoia made luminous, delicate, and carefully crafted monotypes, or single impression prints. He was represented by a prominent art dealer, Carl Nierendorf, and his work was shown in and collected by major museums across the United States. In many ways, his printmaking was foundational to his synthetic approach to art and design. His experimental techniques anticipated the physicality of his sculpture and that complex interplay between object and image that ran through his cross-disciplinary practice. In the 1950s, as sculpture became his central pursuit, Bertoia explored forms and effects in his monotypes that would eventually find expression in 3 dimensions, so that the space of the page really became a rich site of exploration and discovery for the rest of his life. Today, I'm going to focus on 3 episodes from Bertoia's career in the 1940s in order to trace the development of his practice and thinking in this medium. Bertoia was an artist whose work defied strict categorization, and over the years, he referred to his monotypes variously as prints, drawings, paintings, byproducts, and prototypes, typologies and techniques that overlap and even contradict each other. Bertoia's monotype practice, and especially as it unfolded in the 1940s, really embodied a profound in-betweenness that would come to characterize his whole creative practice, an irreconcilable and productive tension between, on the one hand, the kind of purity of non-objective or abstract art, and on the other, the instrumentalization of industrial technologies and design for use. So, our first episode, retreat into non-objective purity. So Bertoia described his initial forays into monotype as a backdoor escape from his teaching duties as the instructor of metalcraft at Cranbrook Academy of Art. Since assuming control of the metal workshop as a scholarship student in 1937, Bertoia had been making finely crafted vessels and jewelry that demonstrated his facility with a range of techniques for shaping metal. His course offerings reflected the school's commitment to craft in the service of good design. And he was also involved in a couple of major design competitions, including Eero Saarinen and Charles Eames winning entries into the Museum of Modern Art's Organic Design in Home Furnishings competition. And on the right of the screen, you're seeing one of the entry panels for this, featuring little models of the design chairs created by Bertoia. Bertoia's days at Cranbrook were consumed by the rigors of metalcraft and design for use. And in the evenings, he retreated to a world of pure image creation. Initially, Bertoia made figurative woodcut prints, but he grew bored with the fact that, but for subtle variations produced by modulating the amount of ink or pressure applied, the same image would be turned out of the press again and again. Bertoia's solution to the tedium of the exactly repeated image was to cut up the printing matrix, creating small blocks of wood in geometric shapes, the uncarved surfaces of which he inked and stamped directly on the page. And from this original act grew a body of work of almost magical properties, intimate compositions of luminous layers of ink rolled and pressed onto delicate sheets of translucent paper. Bertoia delighted in the flexibility and directness of this method of printing, placing geometric shapes and lines in dynamic relation to one another. He experimented with color, opacity, and repetition, often stamping his blocks multiple times on the tissue-thin paper without re-inking in between impressions. He began laying grounds of ink rolled unevenly with a rubber roller called a brayer directly on the page. And eventually he introduced a smooth glass plate as a surface upon which to stamp. He would impress the image by laying a dampened sheet of paper over the inked plate and then rolling a clean brayer across the verso of the page, or simply by applying pressure with his hands. This method of block printing enabled him to work directly and without the use of a printing press, which meant he could create his prints virtually anywhere. Initially, Bertoia had little art historical context for the abstract imagery that he had stumbled into. He worked alone in the printmaking studio at Cranbrook. No formal instruction was offered, and there was no community of printmakers, nor even any abstract painters encouraging his efforts. And Bertoia would later recall showing his monotypes to Elio Saarinen, the president of Cranbrook Academy of Art, who advised him to stick with metalwork. But Bertoia's confidence was bolstered by two sales to major museums. In early 1942, he sold a suite of 30 prints to the Wadsworth Atheneum right here in Hartford, Connecticut. And a year later, Bertoia sent 99 of his monotypes for critical feedback to Hilla Rebay, the founding director of the Museum of Non-Objective Painting, now the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum in New York. And much to Bertoia's surprise, Rebay purchased the whole lot and dozens more in the months that followed, promising to make constant exhibitions of his work in the museum. For ease of reference, Rebay gave Bertoia's monotypes descriptive and musical titles, calling attention to his use of specific colors and to the rhythmic nature of the repeated stamped forms. And though they never met in person, Bertoia and Rebay carried on a spirited correspondence in which the elder doyenne of non-objective art offered her advice and criticism, sent texts and catalogs for Bertoia to read, and connected him with like-minded artists. In monotype, Bertoia could achieve effects impossible by any other means. While he rejected the exactly repeatable image of a stable matrix, he exploited other essential elements of printmaking. For example, the use of pressure to transfer ink from one surface to another, of repetition, reversal, and inversion, the ability to work in series, and the matchless luminosity and clarity of the slow-drying printing inks. And we see all of these attributes at play in one of the prints acquired by Rebay in 1943 for the Museum of Non-Objective Painting. Here on the screen, you see Bertoia stamped oblique, triangular shapes in fading sequences, creating a remarkable sense of depth as the intensity of the black ink diminished with each pressing. Bertoia likely used an unevenly inked brayer to create that atmospheric ground that frames the zigzagging shapes. Bright orange and yellow triangles and lines sit thickly on the page, their subtle dimensionality enlivening the composition. Though modest in size, Bertoia's jewel-like early prints were complex and layered, while retaining a sense of the immediacy and experimentation afforded by his stamping technique. Now, the rapid development of Bertoia's work in monotype in the early 1940s was really enabled by the United States' entry into World War II. Metal shortages caused the suspension of the metalcraft program at Cranbrook in 1942, leaving Bertoia ample time for his newfound creative outlet. But while his monotypes were drawing praise in advanced art circles in New York, Bertoia's usefulness at Cranbrook waned. And in his final year, he taught 2 evening classes in printmaking to only a handful of students. His practice was deemed by the Academy's leadership too idiosyncratic to support a full-fledged printmaking program. And thus, in the summer of 1943, Bertoia accepted a timely job offer from Charles Eames to move to Southern California and work for him in defense manufacturing. And in this new setting, on the front lines of industrial design, Bertoia began to frame his printmaking practice less as a retreat into non-objective purity and more an active engagement with the conditions of advanced industrialization. This brings us to episode 2, drawing as a way of learning. In California, Bertoia continued to experiment with a simple yet generative technique that he had first discovered in the basement at Cranbrook. He would lay a sheet of thin Japanese rice paper over an inked glass plate, and he would draw on the verso of the page with an improvised stylus, like a sharpened stick or a metal palette knife. And wherever his stylus pushed the paper onto the plate, ink was lifted off the plate and embedded on the page, producing a sharp, linear drawing. The thinness of the paper allowed him to create fine, distinct lines while seeing only a vague picture of the image in progress, the wetted page. Areas of grainy shading were achieved by applying pressure either with a brayer, that roller, his fingers, or the heel of his hand. And the final composition would only be revealed when the page was lifted or peeled off the plate, a moment of discovery for the artist. Bertoia often used this technique to work rapidly in series, incorporating ghosts and after images from previously pulled prints. And though Bertoia continued to use his block printing technique throughout the 1940s, he increasingly turned to this method of drawing blindly through the page to feel his way to an image. Bertoia's professional experiences in Southern California had a profound impact on how he thought about his monotypes. Working for Charles Eames in the molded plywood division of the Evans Product Company, Bertoia helped develop and manufacture splints and airplane parts for the war effort, with an eye toward the peacetime application of molded plywood and related technologies to modern furniture. But in a literal sense, Bertoia's monotypes neither used nor made reference to technological processes. The abstract doodles that you just saw and block prints seldom depicted the things of the machine age, and his emphatically artisanal process required little in the way of specialized equipment. But in this new creative community of artists, architects, and designers of the molded plywood division, Bertoia began to frame his prints, in relation to advanced technology, drawing an explicit connection between his way of working and the concerns of contemporary industrial design. And emblematic of Bertoia's shifted frame of reference is a 2-page spread published in the April 1944 issue of Arts and Architecture magazine that featured several monotypes made using his technique of composing linear drawings through the verso of the page. 8 compositions of concentric linear shapes march across the pages like a film strip, suggesting the limitless, even relentless possibilities of his tactile approach. An evocative artist statement accompanies the printed image, in which Bertoia writes, and I'll pull this up a little larger on the screen so you can read along with me. Drawing is a way of learning, a way of finding a truth. A line commences somewhere, gathers momentum, spends its energy, and comes to an equilibrium equivalent to a life cycle. It could also be said that it establishes its norm of balance and dimension. I draw what I don't know in order to learn something about it. And he continues, electrotubes are extensions as well as magnifications of our senses. Neither our senses nor the tubes can be faked. They wouldn't work. The same physical laws that condition the existence of the tube are at work in a drawing, if it is to be any good. There is no place for non-constituents. Each and every part is so integrated that a change by removal or addition would be destructive. Objects can change their form without changing their dimension. Bertoia emphasizes the utility of his method of printmaking as a means of exploration and discovery, while also drawing a provocative analogy to what he calls electrotubes as extensions and magnifications of the senses. I think Bertoia was referring to electron or vacuum tubes, which were vital elements in modern mass communication systems that served to amplify sound waves as they traveled across great distances in telegraphic, telephonic, and radio signals. By invoking electron tubes, Bertoia likened his printmaking process to a system of electronic communication, wherein signals passing from the artist through the page are repeated and amplified. The expressive content of a line is governed, as he says, not by arbitrary whims, but by physical laws that cannot be faked. A monotype sold to the Art Institute of Chicago by his dealer, Karl Nerendorf, offers a compelling visual summation of the forces at play in this statement about Bertoia's practice. Against a silvery ground of ink rolled onto a smooth plate with a brayer, Bertoia has drawn, again, through the verso of the page, a series of dynamic lines that bend and splay in an approximation of a human figure. The figure recalls Paul Klee's Pinwheeling Dancer of 1930, which Bertoia saw illustrated in black and white in a catalog of Klee's paintings published by Nerendorf's gallery in 1941. Bertoia's abstracted figure, reversed in the printing process, its limbs shattered and reverberating, literalizes the idea of drawing as energetic transmission, offering a vision of the artist as electrical conduit. In place of Klee's skeletal hands and feet, the extremities of Bertoia's figure spiral outward like broadcasting radio towers. Here I'm showing you a detail. After lifting the print from the plate, Bertoia used the inked edges of a wooden block to stamp an additional set of white lines onto the surface of the composition that catch light and create a sense of movement flickering across the page. Bertoia's printmaking process was about as low-tech as possible, and his monotypes were much more carefully handcrafted than he lets on in his statement in Arts and Architecture magazine. But in likening his method to the functioning of an electron tube, Bertoia was able to connect his artisanal work to the concerns of contemporary industrial design and manufacture. Drawing via printmaking had become, in Bertoia's proto-cybernetic articulation, a process, an action, and even a technology, as opposed to a completed or finished thing. By describing his process as automated and mechanized, Bertoia had, in his own way, assimilated the conditions of mass production into a technique that could create ever new and varied results. This brings us to the third episode, which I'm calling Object as Image and Image as Object. Now, figuration had crept into Bertoia's monotypes in a variety of ways by the mid-1940s. Several linear prints seem to evoke electronic circuitry, while others allude to Bertoia's interest in science and nature. One exceptional print is especially intriguing for the way that it stages a confrontation between different modes of representation. An atmospheric haze of muted black, brown, and green tones conjures the infinite depth of a night sky. Various floating forms and flying contraptions, most rendered schematically, encircle an exploding light source near the center of the composition. Curving white lines indicate the ghostly afterimage of a cognate print previously pulled from the same plate. And as our eyes scan the page, several marks refuse to cohere to the sense of deep space. For example, a large arrow labeled arrow points to a sequence of outlined shapes moving from circle to ovoid into the upper left corner and then dropping back down toward the center. And above that sequence in the upper left, a line of text reads, from right to left, gas mass under increasing rotational velocity. And here, using the magic of what you can do with a digital image, I'll just flip it so that you can see the text from left to right. Another bit of text emerges in the lower right of the picture beneath a segmented triangle, and it reads retractable. And here again, I will flip it digitally. So it seems that we are dealing in this image with the visual idiom of diagrams set free in the cosmos. Schematic renderings like those in this monotype would have filled Bertoia's days at the Navy Electronics Laboratory at Point Loma near San Diego, where Bertoia worked as a technical and scientific illustrator after leaving the molded plywood division. From 1947 until 1950, when he was hired by Knoll, Bertoia worked in the visual development division on graphics, photography, and layouts for technical reports and instruction books, tasks that appealed to his longstanding interest in the ways in which scientific principles were illustrated. But whereas his job at the Navy Electronics Laboratory required that he combine image and text to communicate concepts unambiguously, the various elements in this monotype operate in disparate and conflicting planes of signification. The sequence in the upper left corner, its source likely a diagram of stellar rotation, drops down the side of the print as the ovoid transforms into a sort of sci-fi flying saucer. The arrow, a mark that would seem to be exclusive to the graphic field, is echoed in the adjacent rocket ship, apparently headed in the same direction. The text appears in reverse on the print because Bertoia annotated his monotypes in the printing process, making it difficult to read unless the viewer is able to turn the page over and hold the print up to the light. The slippages and transformations of text and image undermine their clarity, that is, the content of what is communicated. But in so doing, they call attention to the mode of address. We recognize the scribbles as text, even if it is difficult to read them, and we might even assume that Bertoia wrote it for his own benefit and not for ours. Indeed, Bertoia would routinely insert notes to himself in his later prints, describing light effects or metalworking processes next to various explorations of sculptural forms. The inclusion of these diagrammatic elements remind us of Bertoia's process of drawing through the page, and that the marks in the monotype are registrations of a body and a mind at work. If drawing was a way of learning for Bertoia, here we see him actively interrogating the very structures by which ideas are communicated visually. This interplay between object and image, between the sensation of depth and the flatness of the graphic plane, would be fundamental to his conception of the chairs that he designed for Knoll, and to his larger sculptural practice, which traded on the tactility of worked metal and its impact as a flat and reproducible image. And I'm purposely bringing you here to a blank screen to let your imaginations take over. In a lantern slide presentation delivered at the International Design Conference in Aspen, Colorado in 1955, Bertoia projected a monotype that he identified as a map or genesis of his world of art. He explained to his audience, "It is from this single graphic that I find an endless source of suggestions for growth and development. In its accidentals, I find, as in nature, sublime rationality that brings forth what is truly most enjoyable." Now, exactly which image provided Bertoia with such a deep well of inspiration remains a tantalizing mystery. It was not recorded in any documentation that I could find. But its stated importance confirms the centrality of his monotypes to his creative practice as a whole. And indeed, its absence from the record provides an opportunity for us to imagine that any and all of his monotypes might provide such a map to Bertoia's world of art. His embrace of monotype, this mode of image making that occupies, as art historian Jennifer Roberts has noted, an ineffable space between painting, drawing, and printing, set the stage for a career-long interest in working between and across media. Thank you very much.